The town had no place on modern maps. Hidden deep in the backwoods of Georgia, it lay swallowed by swamps, tangled vines, and the endless shadow of pine forests. The wooden shacks that still stood leaned with age, their roofs caved by storms that had long since passed. Dust clung to every surface, and silence pressed against every street, broken only by the cry of crows circling above. Once, long ago, this place had lived. It had been a mill town, humming with the sound of saws and the shouting of men hauling lumber from the forests. But the river dried, the mill closed, and the people scattered like seeds on the wind. Only a few remained, bound not by hope or industry, but by blood and by secrets too old and too dark to escape. Those who stayed behind were families whose names had been etched into the soil for generations. They tilled failing crops, lived off scraps of trade, and whispered their prayers at night, though heaven seemed far away. Outsiders rarely came down that twisting dirt road, and when they did, their stay was short. Something in the air was heavy here, something that clung to the skin and whispered in the mind, warning travelers not to linger. The townsfolk themselves carried that weight in their eyes, hollow gazes, tight-lipped smiles, and a silence that spoke louder than words. Children were few, their faces pale, their voices subdued, as if they too had inherited the weariness of centuries. It was in this forgotten corner of Georgia, beneath rotting rooftops and within walls soaked with mildew, that the Crowell family ruled. Their house stood larger than the rest, looming at the edge of town like a monument to decay. The townsfolk spoke of them in hushed tones, never openly, never without glancing over their shoulders. For in a place where blood was the only bond that mattered, the Crowells held theirs tighter than most, and that secrecy was what made them feared. The Crowell name was older than the town itself. Their blood ran through its history like a black vein, binding the place to their legacy of power and silence. For generations, the Crowells had claimed land, labor, and loyalty, not through kindness or respect, but through fear and an unspoken code that no one dared break. At the head of the family stood Elijah Crowell, a man whose presence seemed carved from the same stone as the graves that dotted the hillside. His eyes, pale and cold, had watched the town with suspicion for decades. He carried himself as if he owned not just the land, but the people who walked upon it. To Elijah, blood was everything. It was the foundation of his house, the anchor of his authority, and the weapon with which he ruled. The family was marked by strange habits, each generation echoing the one before. They seldom married outside their circle. They seldom welcomed outsiders into their home. And when questions arose about the closeness of their kin, those questions faded as quickly as they were spoken. Some said the Crowells believed themselves chosen, set apart from the decay of the world around them. Others whispered that they were bound by a curse, that the sins of fathers lived again in their sons. Behind the walls of their sagging house, shadows lengthened. Servants who once worked there spoke of hushed arguments, of locked rooms, of whispers carried through thin walls in the dead of night. They spoke of Elijah's iron hand, of his word treated as law, and of the silence demanded from those who lived under his roof. In town, suspicion grew, but no one dared confront it. The Crowells kept to themselves, but their influence stretched through every crooked street. A look from Elijah could chill a man to the bone. A debt owed to him could never be escaped. And those who spoke too boldly against the family often found their barns burned, their wells poisoned, or their names erased from the community altogether. The Crowell house became more than a home. it became a fortress of secrets. Secrets that had begun generations earlier, festering with each passing year, until they poisoned not just the family's blood, but the soil beneath their feet. In that forgotten town, where silence reigned and fear walked hand in hand with tradition, the Crowells were not simply a family. They were a curse, alive and breathing, passed down from father to son. Her name was Clara, a young woman whose beauty seemed out of place in the rotting skeleton of that forgotten town. She had come from elsewhere, though no one could say for certain where. Some whispered she had been brought against her will. Others believed she had been promised to Elijah Crowell in exchange for debts too heavy to pay. However she arrived, the town quickly learned that Clara was no longer her own. She belonged to the Crowells. Elijah took her as his wife, a possession to be held and guarded, like the land he ruled over. In her early days, she was seen walking the dusty roads in silence, her eyes lowered, her step cautious. Soon, even those rare glimpses faded, as she remained behind the walls of the Crowell house, hidden from the world beyond. But within those walls, the silence grew heavier. For Elijah's son, Thomas Crowell, cast his gaze upon her. Whether it was rebellion against his father or the twisted hunger of a man raised without moral compass, Thomas began to claim her in secret. The whispers started quietly, carried on hushed voices in the tavern or the mill. A glance seen through a cracked window, a shadow passing in the night, Clara's figure too often near Thomas when Elijah was away. No one dared speak openly, yet everyone knew. The wife of the father had become the companion of the son, and Clara, caught between them, carried the shame in her silence. Was she victim, coerced by power and fear? Or was she a survivor, bending to the only choices the Crowell name allowed her? No one could say. What was certain was this: the boundaries of blood and marriage had collapsed inside the Crowell home. The house itself seemed to wear the scandal like a cloak. Neighbors spoke of candlelight glowing in the upstairs window at hours when Elijah slept. They spoke of hushed voices drifting into the still night air, voices that sounded too familiar to be anything but kin. The Crowells had long lived by their own rules, but this union, this secret sharing of a wife, twisted those rules into something far darker. From that point forward, the Crowell household was bound in chains of sin and secrecy. And when Clara bore her first child, a shadow fell over the family. For no one, not even Clara herself, could say with certainty whether it was the son's or the father's blood that ran in the veins of her child. The child was named Jacob, though many in the town refused to call him by name. To the people of that forgotten place, he was nothing more than the living proof of the Crowells' shame. His very existence carried a question no one dared answer. Was he the son of Elijah, or the son of Thomas? Father or brother? It made no difference. The blood that flowed in his veins was a tangled knot of sin, and everyone knew it. From the moment of his birth, Jacob seemed marked. His body was frail, his frame thin, his face pale as if the world itself had rejected him. His eyes were sharp but unsettling, too old for a child, as though they carried the weight of generations of buried secrets. The townsfolk whispered that he was cursed, that no good could come from a boy born of such confusion. Behind his back, they called him the most inbred son in Georgia. Growing up beneath the roof of the Crowell house, Jacob knew little of tenderness. Elijah regarded him with suspicion, never fully acknowledging him as his own. Thomas, torn between guilt and pride, drifted between moments of harsh discipline and cold indifference. And Clara, worn down by years of silence and submission, held him close when she could, though even her comfort could not shield him from the shadows of his lineage. As Jacob grew, the signs of strangeness only deepened. He walked alone through the fields, speaking little, always listening, always watching. Other children avoided him, their parents dragging them away whenever his presence drew near. He became a ghost within the town, seen, but never welcomed. A boy who carried his family's corruption like a brand upon his skin, yet inside him a restless fire stirred. Though no one told him the full truth, he sensed it in the way the townsfolk stared, in the hushed voices that fell silent when he passed, in the heavy tension that hung in his home. He began to piece together fragments: an overheard argument, a slip of the tongue, a mother's glance too heavy with sorrow. And as he grew older, Jacob understood that he was not simply cursed by birth. He was the living embodiment of the Crowell's darkest secret. The boy, who should have never been born, had become a mirror in which the entire family's sins were reflected. And in his silence, he carried that truth, waiting for the day when it could no longer be hidden. By the time Jacob reached his late teens, the weight of silence had grown unbearable. The Crowell house, once a fortress of secrets, had become a cage of suspicion and unspoken truths. Every creaking floorboard, every glance at the dinner table seemed to carry the echo of what no one dared confess. Jacob had gathered enough fragments over the years to piece together the truth of his bloodline. He had read letters half burned in the hearth, heard Elijah's drunken curses in the dead of night, and caught Clara's trembling whispers when she believed herself alone. He knew now what the town had whispered all along, that he was both son and grandson, both brother and heir, a child tangled in the family's sins. The knowledge festered inside him, growing into something darker with each passing season. Resentment clung to him like a second skin. He watched Elijah with cold, burning eyes, seeing not a father, but a tyrant who had chained the family to ruin. He watched Thomas, torn between fear and disgust, and saw in him not a brother, but a rival whose blood mingled with his own in ways too twisted to name. And he watched his mother, worn to a shadow of herself, the lines of sorrow carved deep into her face, a woman trapped between obedience and despair. The breaking point came not with a sudden act, but with years of silence piling upon one another until the weight could no longer be borne. Jacob's anger sharpened into purpose. He began to move through the house like a storm gathering in still air, his footsteps heavier, his words sharper, his presence more defiant. The Crowell name, once a shield of fear, now felt to him like a chain choking the last breath from his lungs. What had been hidden in whispers could not remain buried forever. The family's corruption had lived in shadows for too long, and Jacob was determined to drag it into the light, no matter the cost. Blood would answer for blood, and the house that had stood for generations on secrets was destined to crumble. The Crowells, who had ruled their forgotten town through fear and silence, were about to face their reckoning, and it would come from within their own walls. The storm broke inside the Crowell house, but its echoes carried far beyond its rotting walls. Neighbors spoke later of shouts in the night, of glass shattering, of gunfire rolling through the dark like thunder. No one dared go near, for the people of that forgotten town had long learned to turn their eyes away from Crowell business. Yet even from a distance, they felt the shift. Something had finally snapped within the family that had bound them in fear for generations. When dawn came, the Crowell house no longer held its silence. Blood had been spilled across its crooked floorboards, and the dynasty that had once seemed unshakable stood broken. Elijah, the patriarch who had ruled with an iron hand, lay fallen. Thomas, the son who had betrayed and mirrored him, had met the same fate. Clara's cries lingered in the air, torn from a heart that had carried too many years of sorrow. And Jacob, frail Jacob, the boy once scorned as cursed, stood amidst the ruin of his own blood, both victim and executioner. The town could not ignore what had happened. The whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Doors opened, cautious eyes peered out, and the people who had once tiptoed in silence now gathered to watch the downfall of the family that had ruled them. The Crowell secret, long buried, had finally clawed its way into the light. Some said justice had come at last, that the sins of the Crowells had destroyed them from within. Others shuddered, believing that the curse had claimed its final toll. For while the family was broken, their shame remained, hanging over the town like a shadow that would never fully lift. What had once been whispered in corners was now spoken aloud. The Crowells had fallen, not by the hand of outsiders, but by their own blood. The town, bound for so long in silence, found itself standing at the edge of freedom, though even freedom tasted bitter when won through blood and ruin. And though the Crowell house still stood, its walls sagging and its windows dark, it was no longer a fortress. It had become a tomb, a monument to secrets that had festered too long. The reckoning had come, and nothing in that forgotten town would ever be the same. In the months that followed, the Crowell name withered like a dying branch. Their house, once a looming shadow over the town, became a ruin where no one dared linger. Weeds crept up its steps, shutters banged in the wind, and the smell of rot seeped through broken windows. What had been a fortress of power and fear was now only a shell, hollow and cursed. The townsfolk spoke of Jacob in whispers, though none could say where he had gone. Some claimed he had walked into the swamps, never to be seen again. Others swore they saw him drifting down back roads, a solitary figure with eyes as empty as the sky. Whether he was a wanderer seeking peace or a soul forever haunted, no one knew. What remained certain was this: Jacob carried the weight of his family's sins in every step, a living reminder of the darkness that had consumed the Crowells. The town itself never recovered. It had already been dying, but with the fall of the Crowells, it seemed to crumble faster. Families drifted away, their homes left to rot beneath the weight of memory. The mill never reopened. The church bells no longer rang. In time, the town was erased from maps, remembered only in the hushed stories of those who had once lived there. Yet the tale of the Crowells lingered. Across Georgia, it was told in taverns and on porches, a warning wrapped in whispers, of a family that held blood above all else, and of the ruin that followed when blood turned inward. The story grew into legend, the kind spoken in low tones, reminding listeners that secrets, no matter how long they are buried, will one day claw their way to the surface. And so, the Crowells became not just a family lost to time, but a curse carried through memory. Their house decayed, their name faded, but their sin endured, living on in the silence of the pine woods and the abandoned fields of a forgotten town. The legacy of their blood was not land or wealth or honor. It was ruin. It was shame. It was a reminder that some sins cannot be buried, for they take root in the earth itself, and bloom long after the sinners are gone.